I wasn't expecting anyone to be home that early. That's the part that keeps replaying in my head. Like if I just rewind far enough, I could catch the moment where everything still made sense and stop it before it unraveled. It was a Tuesday, middle of June, one of those humid afternoons where the air feels thick, even with the AC running. I had taken the day off work, told my boss I needed a mental health day, which wasn't entirely a lie. Things with my husband, Eric, had been strained. Not explosive, not dramatic, just quiet distance, the kind that creeps in slowly until you realize you haven't really talked in weeks, not in any way that matters. We'd been married for 6 years. I met him when I was 32, divorced once already, and convinced I'd never do the whole marriage thing again. Eric was steady, grounded, a little older than me, with a teenage son from his first marriage, Jason. At the time, Jason was 16, awkward, polite, always disappearing into his room with headphones on. He never caused problems. If anything, he stayed out of the way too much. Now he was 22, college senior, lived at home to save money, worked part-time at some tech store, still quiet, still polite, still mostly invisible. That day, I thought he was at work. I remember standing in the kitchen around noon, staring at my phone, rereading a text from Eric that said he'd be working late again. No explanation, no apology, just, "Don't wait up." It had become his default line. I poured myself a glass of white wine, even though it wasn't even lunchtime yet. That should have been my first red flag. I wasn't the kind of person who drank in the middle of the day. But lately, I'd been making exceptions. The house was too quiet. No TV, no music, just the hum of the AC and the occasional creak of the floors. I wandered into the living room, then back into the kitchen, then upstairs like I was looking for something I couldn't name. I ended up in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of me and Eric when we first got together, smiling, arms wrapped around each other, that effortless kind of closeness that feels impossible to fake. I tried to remember what that felt like, and it honestly scared me how distant it seemed. At some point, I stood up and started undressing, not in a dramatic way. It wasn't like I had a plan. I just felt restless. My clothes felt heavy, suffocating. I stripped down to my underwear and stood there for a second, staring at myself in the mirror. I wasn't in bad shape. I took care of myself, but I didn't see what I used to see. I saw someone tired, someone waiting for something that wasn't coming. I grabbed one of Eric's oversized t-shirts from the dresser and pulled it on, letting it hang loosely over my body. It barely covered my underwear. I didn't care. There was something weirdly freeing about it, like I was stepping outside the version of myself I'd been stuck in. I poured another glass of wine and went downstairs. I don't even remember what I was thinking. That's the truth. My mind was just drifting, bouncing between memories and frustrations and that dull, constant ache of feeling unwanted in your own marriage. I sat on the couch, legs tucked under me, scrolling aimlessly on my phone. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time felt slow, stretched out. And then I heard the front door open. At first, my brain didn't register it. It was just a sound, out of place but not immediately alarming. Then it hit me. Jason. I froze. My first instinct was to stand up, to run upstairs, to grab actual clothes and pretend I hadn't been sitting there half-dressed in the middle of the day like my life was unraveling. But before I could move, he was already there. "Hey," he stopped mid-sentence, and I swear the entire world just locked. He was standing in the entryway, keys still in his hand, backpack slung over one shoulder. His eyes landed on me, and for a split second, neither of us reacted. It was like our brains needed an extra moment to process what we were seeing. I was on the couch, in my underwear and one of his dad's t-shirts that barely covered anything. Hair messy, wine glass in hand, completely exposed in a way I never, ever intended. "Shit," I said under my breath, immediately pulling my legs down and trying to sit up straight, like that would somehow fix it. Jason looked away fast, his face flushing. "Sorry, I thought you..." He tripped over his words, clearly trying not to look directly at me again. "I thought you were at work," I blurted out, which was a stupid thing to say because obviously he wasn't. "Shift got canceled," he said, still not looking at me. "I can just go upstairs or..." "No, it's fine," I cut in too quickly, then immediately regretted how that sounded. I mean, not fine, but just give me a second. I stood up, tugging the shirt down as much as I could, which didn't do much. I could feel his presence behind me, even though he was trying so hard to give me space, to be respectful. It somehow made it worse. I rushed past him toward the stairs, my heart pounding way harder than it should have for something that could have been brushed off as a simple, awkward moment. But it didn't feel simple, not even close. Upstairs, I practically threw open the closet and grabbed the first pair of shorts and tank top I could find. My hands were shaking as I pulled them on, my mind racing in a way I couldn't control. It was just an accident. That's what I kept telling myself. People walk in on each other sometimes. It happens. So why did it feel like something had shifted? I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror again, fully dressed now, but my face looked different. Flushed. Tense. Like I'd just crossed some invisible line. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, then headed back downstairs. Jason was in the kitchen, opening the fridge like nothing had happened, or at least like he was trying really hard to pretend nothing had happened. "Hey," I said, softer this time. "Hey," he replied, still not quite meeting my eyes. There was a pause. Thick. Uncomfortable. "Sorry about that," I added, forcing a small, awkward laugh. "I didn't expect anyone home." "It's okay," he said quickly. "I should have, made more noise or something." "You don't have to announce yourself in your own house," I said, shaking my head. Another pause. He grabbed a bottle of water and leaned against the counter, finally glancing at me for a second before looking away again. But that second was enough, because I saw it. Something in his expression. Not just embarrassment. Something else. Something I couldn't immediately name, but I felt it hit me like a wave. And I hated that I noticed it. I should have just brushed it off, made a joke, changed the subject, done anything normal. Instead, I stood there, hyper aware of everything. How close we were, how quiet the house felt again, how the air seemed heavier than before. "You got any plans today?" I asked, just to fill the silence. He shrugged. "Not really. Probably just stay in, work on some stuff." "Right," I said, nodding like that made sense. Another silence. I could feel my pulse in my throat. This was ridiculous, completely ridiculous. He was my stepson. I had known him since he was a teenager. This shouldn't have felt like anything more than a mildly embarrassing moment. So why couldn't I shake the feeling that something had just started?
Why did it feel like the room had shifted in a way I couldn't undo? Jason cleared his throat. "I'm gonna head upstairs." "Yeah," I said quickly. "Yeah, of course." He walked past me, not too close, but close enough that I caught a faint trace of his cologne, something clean, subtle, not the cheap stuff he used to wear in high school. I stayed in the kitchen, staring at nothing, listening to his footsteps go up the stairs and his door close. And that should have been the end of it. It should have just been a weird, awkward moment we both forgot about by the next day. But standing there, alone again, I had this sinking feeling in my chest, because deep down, I already knew. Something had changed, and I didn't know how to fix it. I tried to act normal after that. That's what I kept telling myself I was doing. Normal, like nothing had happened, like the house hadn't suddenly developed a new kind of silence that pressed in from every direction. But normal is harder to fake when you're constantly aware of your own body and space, when every sound from upstairs makes your stomach tighten, when you find yourself listening for footsteps you're pretending not to care about. Jason stayed in his room for most of the evening. I could hear it, soft movements through the ceiling, the occasional creak of his chair, the faint sound of his laptop opening and closing. Nothing unusual. He always kept to himself. That was his default setting. But now I was hyper aware of it in a way I never had been before. I kept busy downstairs, cleaned things that didn't need cleaning, wiped counters that were already clean, opened the fridge 3 times without actually taking anything out. I even tried watching a show, but I couldn't follow a single scene. My mind kept drifting back to that moment at the door, the split second when everything had frozen. It wasn't just embarrassment that stuck with me. It was the way my body reacted before my brain could even catch up. That sharp, immediate awareness of being seen. Not just seen, but interrupted, exposed in a way that went deeper than clothing. I didn't like thinking about it, so I tried not to. By the time Eric came home, it was almost 9. I heard his keys first, then the front door opening, then the familiar rhythm of him dropping his work bag by the entryway like it weighed too much to carry one more step. He came into the kitchen rubbing the back of his neck, looking exhausted in that familiar way that used to make me feel sympathetic. Now it just made me feel distant. "Hey," I said. "Hey," he replied, kissing my cheek quickly without really looking at me. That was new too. Or maybe it wasn't new. Maybe I was just noticing it now. He went straight to the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter like his bones were tired. "Long day?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded. Meeting ran late. Then I had to deal with Mark's mass again.
I waited for him to say more. He didn't. That used to be enough for me, these small updates about his day. I used to be able to sit across from him and feel like I was part of it somehow, even when I wasn't physically there. Now, I just felt like I was hearing someone else's life described in fragments. "You eat yet?" I asked. "Yeah, grabbed something," he said, still not really looking at me. "Jason home?" "Yeah," I said. "He's upstairs." "Good," Eric muttered, like that solved something. And just like that, he disappeared into his routine. Shower, phone calls, emails. The usual orbit he moved in when he was home but not really present. I stayed downstairs longer than I needed to, pretending I was tidying up, waiting for something I couldn't name to settle. At some point, Jason came down. I didn't hear him at first. I just felt it, like a shift in the air before I saw him. He paused at the bottom of the stairs when he noticed I was in the kitchen. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey," I replied, too quickly. He walked into the kitchen, opened the cabinet, grabbed a glass. His movements were careful, deliberate, like he was trying not to take up too much space. Neither of us mentioned earlier, not directly. But it was there, hanging between us like an unspoken agreement to pretend. "You good?" I asked, immediately regretting it because it sounded too concerned. "Yeah," he said, "just hungry." "Make something," I offered, then gestured vaguely to the fridge. "There's leftovers." He nodded. "Thanks." He pulled out a container, leaned against the counter opposite me, and started heating it in the microwave. The silence came back, that it wasn't the same silence as before. Before, it had just been empty space. Now, it felt occupied. I found myself watching him without meaning to. Not in a dramatic way, just small things. The way he leaned slightly on one leg, the way he kept his eyes mostly on the microwave numbers instead of me, the way he seemed more aware of the room than usual. And then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten again. He was doing the same thing. Not staring, not openly looking, but aware. Like he could feel me there in a way he didn't know how to process either. The microwave beeped, and he moved quickly, almost too quickly, like he was grateful for an excuse to break the stillness. "I'm going to eat upstairs," he said. "Okay," I replied, but neither of us moved right away. For a second, it felt like there was something unsaid sitting right on the edge of being spoken, something neither of us was brave enough, or maybe stupid enough, to touch. Then he grabbed his food and left the kitchen, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was projecting my own discomfort on a completely normal situation, that nothing had changed except my awareness of an embarrassing moment. But that wasn't entirely true, because over the next few days I started noticing small shifts I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just Jason avoiding me, it was the timing of it, the way he seemed to leave rooms just slightly earlier than before, the way he didn't linger in shared spaces unless Eric was around, the way his greetings got shorter, more careful, and worse than that, the way I started adjusting too. I'd time my movements in the house differently. I'd hesitate before going into the kitchen if I thought he might be there. I'd listen before walking down the hallway. I'd find myself planning my routes through my own home like I was avoiding someone I wasn't supposed to be avoiding. Eric didn't notice anything, or maybe he did but just didn't think it mattered. He was gone most evenings that week. Work stuff, meetings, dinners I wasn't invited to or didn't want to go to. The space between us kept widening in small, quiet increments that didn't feel dramatic enough to confront. One night, around midnight, I came downstairs for water. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the kitchen light I'd left on earlier. I expected silence, everyone asleep. But Jason was there. Sitting at the kitchen island, laptop open, headphones on but not fully covering his ears. A half-empty cup of coffee beside him. He looked up when I walked in. We both froze for half a second. Then he quickly pulled one ear of his headphones off. "Sorry," he said immediately. "Didn't think anyone was up." "I couldn't sleep," I said, grabbing a glass and trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah," he replied. Neither of us moved away right away. I poured water slowly, aware of how loud it sounded in the quiet kitchen. Every small sound felt amplified. "You've been up late a lot," I said before I could stalk myself. He shrugged. "Final projects, work, stuff." "Right," I said. Another pause. I leaned against the counter across from him without really deciding to. It just happened. And that was when I noticed it again. That careful awareness in him. Not fear, not discomfort exactly. Something more controlled, like he was actively managing his reactions. It made me more aware of myself too, of how close we were standing without intending to be, of how quiet the house felt around us, of how late it was, how alone we were in that moment. "I should probably head up," I said finally. "Yeah," he replied quickly, but neither of us moved immediately. Then he closed his laptop. "I'll go first," he said. He stood, grabbed his cup, and walked past me without touching, without looking too long. But as he passed, I felt it again, that strange, unsettling awareness of him that I couldn't fully explain away anymore. And when I finally went upstairs, I didn't sleep either. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that nothing had shifted, even though I already knew it had, and I had no idea what was coming next. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it. That became my routine. Wake up, replay everything in my head, decide I was reading too much into it, and promise myself I'd act normal today. Then I'd go downstairs and immediately feel that same tight awareness settle back into my chest like nothing had been resolved at all. By the end of that week, I was exhausted in a way sleep didn't fix. It wasn't just Jason anymore. It was everything layered on top of everything else. Eric barely speaking to me unless it was logistical, Jason moving around the house like he was carefully avoiding accidental proximity, and me stuck in the middle of my own thoughts, trying to pretend I wasn't tracking all of it like a pattern I didn't want to see forming. The worst part was how quiet Eric and I had become without ever actually deciding to be quiet. We'd sit in the same room and not talk. He'd scroll through his phone. I'd pretend to read or watch something I wasn't really paying attention to. Occasionally, he'd mention work, or I'd mention something trivial about the house, and it would die immediately after leaving our mouths. We used to fill silence without trying. Now silence felt like the only thing we shared. Jason, on the other hand, was becoming more present and less present at the same time. He was around the house more than Eric, but somehow harder to actually connect with, like he existed in a different layer of the same space. I noticed he started eating at odd hours, coming down when I wasn't expecting him, then disappearing again quickly. If I was in the kitchen, he'd pause at the doorway for a second, like he was calculating whether to enter or turn around. And every time that happened, I felt this strange pressure in my chest I didn't have a name for. It wasn't attraction. I told myself that firmly, repeatedly, like labeling it wrong would make it disappear. It was awareness, hyper-awareness, of him, of myself, of the space between us that had somehow become charged with meaning neither of us had invited. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when Jason came downstairs. Eric was at work. The house was otherwise empty. I didn't hear him coming, but I felt him before I saw him again, that subtle shift in the air that had started happening more often. "Hey," he said. I looked up. "Hey." He paused at the bottom step, not fully in the room yet, like he was still deciding whether to commit to being there. "I'm just grabbing something to eat," he added. "Go ahead," I said, forcing my tone to stay light. He walked into the kitchen, and I went back to folding towels, trying to focus on the simple physical task in front of me. Stack, fold, repeat. Something predictable, but my attention kept drifting. Not toward him exactly, toward the fact that I was aware of him even when I wasn't looking. The microwave beeped. Cabinets opened. A chair shifted slightly as he sat at the counter instead of going upstairs. That was new. He didn't usually stay in shared spaces when I was there alone. I told myself not to read into it, but then I heard him clear his throat slightly, like he was about to speak and stopped himself. "You working today?" he asked finally. "No," I said, "day off." "Right," he replied. Silence again. I stood up with the folded laundry and hesitated, unsure where to take it just so I wouldn't feel stuck in the same room doing nothing. When I turned back toward the kitchen, I saw him watching me for a fraction of a second before quickly looking down at his food. It was so brief I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Almost. "I've been meaning to ask," I said, mostly to break the tension I couldn't fully explain. "How's school going? Everything okay with finals and stuff?" He nodded. "Yeah, just busy." "That's good though," I said. "Busy is better than..." I stopped myself before finishing. Better than what? Better than this? Better than whatever weird emotional static had settled into the house lately? He didn't respond immediately. Then, quietly, "Yeah," that was it. But the way he said it made something in me shift again. Not in a dramatic way, in a subtle, uncomfortable way, like I'd pressed against something fragile without meaning to. I left the room after that. Not abruptly, just naturally exiting, like I had somewhere else to be. I went upstairs and folded the rest of the laundry in the bedroom, even though I could have easily done it downstairs. I started doing that more often, creating distance I didn't fully admit I was creating. That night, Eric came home later than usual. I was already in bed when he got in. I heard him moving around downstairs, then eventually coming up, showering, the usual rhythm of a man who was tired but not present in any emotional sense. He came into the bedroom after midnight. "You still awake?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face like he was trying to wipe the day off. "I feel like I barely see you lately," I said before I could stop myself. He let out a tired breath. "Work's been insane, I told you that." "I know," I said. "It's just..." I didn't finish again. He turned slightly toward me, like he was waiting for me to complete the thought. When I didn't, he just nodded slowly. "We're fine," he said after a moment, like that was supposed to settle everything. I didn't respond, because I didn't know if that was true anymore, or if it even mattered in the same way it used to. The next day is when things started feeling different in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. It was late afternoon. I was in the kitchen again, making coffee I didn't really want, just to have something to do with my hands. Jason came in from outside, hair slightly damp, like he'd just come back from a run or a walk. He didn't say anything immediately, just grabbed water from the fridge. But when he turned around, he didn't leave right away. He lingered. That was the first time I noticed that word in my head. Lingered. "I've been meaning to say," he started, then stopped. I looked at him. "Yeah?" He hesitated again, shifting his weight slightly. "About that day." My stomach tightened instantly.
I knew exactly which day, without him needing to specify. "I didn't mean to make it weird," he said quickly. "I just didn't expect it." "It's fine," I cut in immediately, maybe too fast. "It was just an awkward moment, that's all." He nodded, but didn't look fully convinced. "I wasn't trying to," he started again, then stopped himself. We both stood there for a second without speaking, and in that silence, I became painfully aware of how carefully we were both choosing words. Like anything slightly wrong could tip something over that we were both pretending wasn't there. "You're overthinking it," I said softly, even though I wasn't sure if I was talking to him or myself. "Yeah," he said, but his voice didn't match the word. Then he took his water and left. But this time, I didn't feel relief when he was gone. I felt something closer to unease, because now it wasn't just me noticing the tension. It was acknowledged. Not defined, not spoken clearly, but acknowledged in a way that changed how it existed between us. Over the next couple of days, things didn't escalate in any obvious way. There were no dramatic moments, no confrontations, no confessions, just subtle shifts. A glance held half a second too long before being pulled away, a pause before speaking, a moment where one of us would enter a room and immediately become aware of the other like it required adjustment. It started affecting how I moved through the house again. I caught myself timing things, waiting before going into the kitchen, listening for footsteps before leaving my room, feeling a strange growing awareness of my own presence in spaces I used to take for granted. One evening, I found myself sitting in the living room after Eric had gone to bed early. The TV was on but muted. I wasn't watching it. Jason was upstairs. I could hear faint movement again, and I realized something that made my stomach turn in a different way than before. I wasn't just avoiding awkwardness anymore. I was thinking about the avoidance, about the awareness itself, about the fact that something unspoken had started existing in the same house, between the same people, without anyone choosing it, and I didn't know what it meant, or what it was turning into, or what it would become if it kept going like this. I just knew I couldn't stop noticing it anymore, and that scared me more than anything that had actually happened so far. By the time the weekend came, it felt like I was living inside a pressure system that never fully released. Nothing had exploded, nothing had been exposed, nothing had been said out loud in any meaningful way. And somehow that was worse. Because when something is clearly broken, you can start figuring out how to fix it or leave it or rebuild it or whatever comes next. But when it's just tension, invisible and constant, you end up questioning your own perception of reality. You start wondering if you're imagining it, if you're the problem, if you're the one turning ordinary moments into something they're not. That's where I was. Eric left early Saturday morning to meet a client, which I later learned probably meant another one of those half-work, half-social things he never invited me to anymore. Jason was still home. I knew because I heard him in the kitchen before I even got out of bed. Not loudly, just the small sounds of someone trying not to make noise in a shared space. I stayed upstairs longer than usual, not because I was doing anything important, but because I wasn't ready to step into whatever version of the day was waiting downstairs. When I finally came down, he was at the counter with his laptop open, eating cereal straight from the bowl. He looked up when I entered. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied. And just like that, we were back in it again. That strange, careful rhythm that had formed between us without permission. I poured coffee and stood at the far end of the counter instead of sitting. I noticed I did that now. Distance was becoming automatic. "You got plans today?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not really, just catching up on stuff." "Same," I said, even though I hadn't planned anything at all. There was a pause where neither of us looked fully comfortable holding eye contact for too long, but also didn't fully avoid it either. It was always like that now, a kind of controlled uncertainty. Then he said something that changed the shape of the room without raising his voice. "I think we should probably act normal again." I blinked. "We are normal." He hesitated. "No, I mean actually normal." That landed heavier than it should have. I leaned back slightly against the counter, gripping my mug tighter than necessary. "We are acting normal. It was just an awkward moment. That's all it was." He nodded, but not immediately, like he was deciding whether to accept that or challenge it. "Yeah," he said finally. "I know.
But he didn't sound convinced, and neither did I. The rest of the morning passed in fragments. He stayed in the living room, I stayed in the kitchen. We crossed paths once or twice, exchanged short sentences about nothing that mattered, and avoided anything that did. At some point, I went upstairs to change sheets just to have something physical to focus on. That's when Eric came back, earlier than expected. I heard the front door before I heard his voice, then his footsteps, then the drop of his keys on the counter. He called my name once, casually. I responded from upstairs, "I'm here." He came up a few minutes later. His expression was already different from the usual tiredness, sharper, focused. "I stopped by the house real quick before my meeting got pushed," he said. "Okay," I replied, still pulling a fitted sheet over the mattress. He stood in the doorway for a moment instead of coming in fully. "Everything okay here?" he asked. That question hit differently than it normally would have. I stopped moving. "Yeah? Why?" He shrugged slightly, but his eyes stayed on me longer than usual. "Just feels off lately." There it was. Not accusation, not clarity, just observation. I forced a small laugh. "Nothing's off, you're just busy." He didn't respond right away. Then quietly, "Jason's been acting weird too." My hands went still on the sheet. "That's not true," I said too quickly. Eric tilted his head slightly. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" I didn't answer, because answering meant admitting something existed, and I wasn't ready to define what that something was. He nodded slowly, like my silence was already an answer. "I don't know what's going on in this house lately," he said, more to himself than to me. Then he turned and went back downstairs. I stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the bed I had just made like it suddenly belonged to someone else. That afternoon, everything felt heavier. Even the light coming through the windows looked different, too bright in some places, too dull in others. The house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a space where everyone was carefully pretending not to notice each other noticing each other. Jason and I didn't speak much that day, not because anything happened, but because nothing needed to happen for the silence to feel loaded. At one point, I heard him on the phone in his room. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone sounded normal, grounded, like he was talking to someone outside of all this. That made something in me tighten unexpectedly.
Because it reminded me that he had a world outside this house, a version of himself that wasn't wrapped up in whatever this strange tension had become, and I was still stuck inside it. Later that evening, Eric asked if I wanted to go out for dinner. It wasn't really a question. It was more like a routine attempt at fixing something without naming it. I almost said no, but I said yes instead. We went to a place downtown, one of those mid-range restaurants with soft lighting and too many tables too close together. The kind of place where conversations feel like they're supposed to matter more than they actually do. At first, it was almost normal. Almost. He talked about work. I nodded. I talked about small things at home. He nodded. Then there was a pause where he set his fork down and looked at me differently. Not angry, not confused. Tired. "You've been distant," he said. I exhaled slowly. "I'm not distant." He shook his head slightly. "You are. Something's changed." I looked down at my plate because looking at him felt too direct. "I don't know what you want me to say," I replied. "Just tell me what's going on," he said, "because I feel like I'm walking into a house I don't recognize anymore." That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else that night. I didn't have an answer, not one I could say out loud. So I did what I'd been doing for weeks. I avoided it. "I think you're just stressed," I said. He let out a short breath through his nose, like he didn't agree but also didn't have the energy to argue. We finished dinner in silence that felt heavier than when we arrived. When we got home, Jason was in the living room. He looked up when we walked in, then quickly stood like he wasn't sure if he should be sitting there in the first place. "Hey," he said. "Hey," Eric replied, still distant. I noticed Jason's eyes briefly shift toward me, then away. That tiny movement said more than anything else that day. Eric went upstairs first. I stayed in the entryway for a moment, dropping my keys slowly into the bowl like I needed something to do with my hands before moving again. Jason lingered near the hallway. We were both aware of Eric upstairs. The house was quiet in that layered way it gets when someone is physically present but not emotionally engaged. "I'm gonna head up," Jason said. "Okay," I replied. He started walking, then paused briefly like he wanted to say something else but couldn't find the shape of it. Then he just continued upstairs. I stood there for a long time after he was gone, because for the first time I understood something clearly enough that it made my chest feel tight in a different way. This wasn't just tension anymore. It was avoidance, on all sides. The next morning, Eric was gone early again. Jason was in his room, and I was alone in the kitchen, staring at a coffee cup I hadn't touched yet, realizing I was running out of ways to describe what was happening without finally admitting it was already happening. The house wasn't breaking loudly. It was drifting apart quietly, and I didn't know which part of it I was supposed to hold on to anymore. The problem with silence is that it starts to feel like an answer,
By the time Monday came around, I wasn't even pretending things were normal anymore. I was just functioning inside them, like someone moving through a place they used to live but don't fully recognize now. Eric left before sunrise. Jason stayed in his room. I stayed in mine longer than I needed to. Nobody crossed paths unless it was unavoidable. And yet I could feel everything anyway. It wasn't dramatic. No arguments, no confrontations, no sudden revelations. It was worse than that. It was consistency. The same distance, repeated daily, until it stopped feeling like distance and started feeling like structure. I went downstairs around mid-morning and found Jason already in the kitchen again. That had become a pattern too. Him being there when I wasn't expecting it. Me adjusting to it too quickly afterward. He looked up when I entered, then back down at his phone like it was a reflex. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied. I poured coffee. He closed his phone. Neither of us moved for a moment. It should have been simple by now. We should have been past whatever awkward threshold we'd crossed. People have embarrassing moments. They recover. They forget. But that wasn't happening. Instead, we were orbiting something neither of us named, both of us pretending we weren't orbiting it at all. "You working today?" I asked. He shook his head. "Later tonight." I nodded. "Long shift?" "Yeah," he said. Then after a pause, "Probably good." That last word hung there longer than it should have. Good. Like being away from the house was something we both understood without saying a lie. I took a sip of coffee, watching him out of the corner of my eye. He was scrolling again, but not really reading, just moving his thumb like it gave him something to focus on. "You and Eric okay?" he asked suddenly. The question hit too directly. I almost laughed, but it came out more like air leaving my chest. "Yeah, why wouldn't we be?" He shrugged. "Just feels quiet." I stared at my mug for a second too long. "He's busy." Jason nodded like that was a complete explanation, even though none of us believed it was. Then he grabbed his keys. "I'm gonna head out for a bit before work," he said. "Okay," I replied. He paused near the door. That pause again. The same one that had started happening more often than I wanted to count. Like he was standing at the edge of something and choosing not to step over it. But this time, instead of leaving immediately, he turned slightly back toward me. "I don't want things to be weird," he said quietly. I didn't answer right away, because the honest response would have been admitting they already were. So I kept it controlled. "They're not weird," I said. "We're fine." He looked at me for a moment longer than usual. Then he nodded. But he still didn't look convinced. And then he left. The door closed behind him, and the house went back to its usual kind of empty. Except now I couldn't tell if it was empty, or just divided. That afternoon, I tried to distract myself with anything physical. Cleaning, laundry, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. I even vacuumed the same hallway twice without realizing it. But every task eventually led me back to thinking. Thinking about Jason, about Eric, about the way conversations had become carefully constructed instead of natural, about the way I had started monitoring movement in my own home like I was waiting for something to happen. And the worst part was how much I had started noticing Jason noticing me. Not in a direct way. Not obvious. Never obvious. It was always small. A glance that stopped half a second too early. A silence that came a fraction too late. The way he positioned himself in rooms now so there was always a little more space than necessary, unless Eric was around, in which case everything tightened again. It was like we had both agreed to something without ever speaking it out loud, and that agreement was starting to feel heavier every day. That night, Eric came home later than usual again. I was already in bed when I heard him come upstairs. He didn't come in right away, just stayed in the hallway for a few seconds like he was deciding whether to enter or not. That alone told me everything I didn't want to hear.
When he finally came in, he didn't even sit on the bed, just stood there for a moment. "I talked to Jason today," he said. My stomach tightened immediately, but I kept my voice steady. "About what?" He hesitated. "Just checked in." I sat up slightly. "And?" "He says everything's fine," Eric replied. A short pause. Then he added, "But I don't think he's telling me everything." I didn't respond, because I didn't know what part of that sentence scared me more, that Eric was noticing, or that Jason was already choosing what to hide. Eric finally sat down at the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands over his face. "I don't like whatever's going on here," he said quietly. I stared at him. He wasn't angry. That was the strange part. He just looked worn down by something he couldn't quite name. And I realized in that moment that he was on the outside of it, just like I was. But Jason wasn't. Jason was in the center of it, whether he meant to be or not. And I didn't know how to explain that without making everything worse. So I said nothing. Eric lay down a few minutes later, turning away from me. The room went quiet again, but I didn't sleep. Because now it wasn't just awareness anymore. It was anticipation. Not of something dramatic, just something continuing. Something I could no longer pretend wasn't forming. The next day, Jason didn't come downstairs in the morning. That was new. By noon, I started noticing I was checking for him without meaning to. By afternoon, I realized I was waiting for the sound of movement upstairs before I did anything else. And by evening, when Eric left again, I was standing in the kitchen alone, realizing I was actively aware of how long it had been since I'd last seen him. That was the moment it stopped feeling accidental, because when I finally did hear footsteps upstairs, I didn't move immediately. I just stood there, listening, waiting. And that's when I understood something I hadn't been willing to name before. This wasn't just tension anymore. It was something we were all participating in, even if none of us were saying it. And I didn't know what would happen when someone finally did. I didn't go upstairs right away. That's the part that still bothers me when I replay it. There was no reason for me to stand there in the kitchen, listening to footsteps above me like I was waiting for permission to move through my own house. No reason to feel my pulse slow down just because I heard a door open upstairs then close again. But I did. And I remember thinking, even in that moment, that I was starting to behave like someone who was no longer fully in control of her own reactions. When I finally went upstairs, it wasn't because I decided to. It was more like I ran out of reasons not to. Jason's door was closed. That alone shouldn't have meant anything. He closed his door all the time. He was 22. He wanted privacy. He lived here. It was normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. Not in the way I used to understand it. I passed his room slowly. I didn't stop. I didn't knock. I kept walking to the bathroom at the end of the hall, telling myself I was just getting ready for bed early. Except I wasn't tired. I was aware. That word kept coming back now, like it was the only accurate thing left. Aware of footsteps, aware of doors, aware of timing, aware of the way the house seemed to shift depending on who was where. I turned on the bathroom light and closed the door behind me. For a second, I just stood there. Then I looked at myself in the mirror. I don't know what I expected to see. Someone different, maybe. Someone making obvious mistakes. Someone who looked like they were living inside something wrong. But I just looked like me. And that somehow made it worse. Because there was no visible line I could point to and say I had crossed it. There was just accumulation. Moments that didn't mean anything alone, but together started to feel like they were building towards something none of us had agreed to. I washed my face, even though I didn't need to. Brushed my hair, even though I wasn't going anywhere. I stayed in there longer than necessary just to delay going back out. When I finally opened the door, I froze. Jason was standing in the hallway. Not close enough to be dramatic, not far enough to feel accidental. Just there. Like he had been moving and stopped when he saw the light under the door change. We both held still. No one said anything for a second too long. Then he shifted slightly, like he was going to step back, or forward, or just out of the way entirely. But he didn't. Sorry, he said quietly. I was just... He stopped. I waited. He didn't finish the sentence. That unfinished thought hung between us more heavily than anything either of us had actually said so far. It's fine, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. Another pause. He glanced past me toward the bathroom, then back at me again. Eric wasn't home. That thought arrived uninvited and stayed longer than I liked. I thought you were asleep, he said. I wasn't, I replied. That should have been the end of it. He should have walked past me. I should have stepped aside. We should have returned to our separate parts of the house and let the night continue like it always did. But neither of us moved. And that was new. Not the silence. The refusal to break it. Jason cleared his throat slightly, like he was trying to reset himself. I didn't mean to make things weird the other day, he said again, almost like he was picking up an unfinished conversation from before. You already said that, I replied before I could stop myself. He nodded slowly. I know. I don't know how to fix it. That word again. Fix. Like something had already been declared broken, even if no one had officially named what it was. I leaned slightly against the wall without realizing I was doing it, my body doing something before my mind fully approved it. There's nothing to fix, I said. But even as I said it, I could hear how unconvincing it sounded. Jason looked at me for longer this time. Not intense, not dramatic, just present, like he was trying to understand something without pushing too hard against it. I feel like I'm messing things up without meaning to, he said. That landed differently than everything before it, because it wasn't about accusation. It was about awareness and responsibility and something closer to confusion than guilt. I should have ended it there, walked past him, gone into my room, closed the door. Instead, I stayed. I think everyone feels that way lately, I said. That was the truth, in the simplest sense. He nodded but didn't look relieved. We stood there for another moment that stretched too long to feel natural. Then, from downstairs, we heard the front door. Eric. Both of us reacted without meaning to, not physically stepping back, not dramatically shifting, but something subtle in the air between us tightening instantly. Jason moved first this time. I'm gonna go, he said quickly. Okay, I replied. He walked past me, close enough that I could feel the movement of air as he passed, but not close enough to touch. He didn't look at me this time. That should have made it easier, but it didn't, because now I knew something I hadn't fully admitted before. This wasn't just something happening in shared space. It was something we were both actively adjusting around, and that made it real in a way I didn't want to define.
I went into my room and closed the door, just as Eric came upstairs. He didn't ask questions, he didn't say anything unusual. He just came in, dropped his keys, and started talking about something irrelevant from his day, like everything in the house was still operating the same way it used to. And I listened, but I couldn't focus on it, because my mind kept going back to that moment in the hallway. Jason standing there, me standing there, neither of us moving first. And the terrifying part wasn't what had been said, it was how easily it could have become something else, if either of us had taken one more step, if either of us had stayed silent just a little longer, if Eric hadn't come home exactly when he did. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling again, but this time I wasn't confused. I was aware of something shifting into place that I couldn't undo by ignoring it anymore. Because whatever this was, it was no longer accidental, and I didn't know how long it could stay unspoken before it finally stopped being silent.